This is an ABC podcast.
In the early 1990s, I spent 2 months travelling around Ireland. In Galway, I stayed in a little B&B that was next to a quay that was known in Galway as the Long Walk, because this is where the ships that were filled with Irish emigrants to America and to Australia would leave, while their loved ones who remained would pace alongside the ship, waving goodbye. Ireland in the early 90s seemed to me at the time like it was sort of sleepwalking through life. But there were powerful forces stirring under the surface that were to transform Ireland. It would give up its dream of becoming the model Catholic nation, a beacon to the world, and become a modern secular nation. I'm very pleased to say Fintan O'Toole is here. Fintan's an author and a journalist. He writes for the Irish Times, for the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, the Guardian. He writes on Ireland, Britain and the United States. Fintan O'Toole lived through this remarkable transformation. He grew up in an Ireland which had made an art of both knowing and not knowing, of turning a blind eye to things best not mentioned. Fintan has written a wonderful book. It's called We Don't Know Ourselves, a personal history of Ireland since 1958. Hello, Fintan. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be here.
It's a wonderful title, We Don't Know Ourselves. Where do you get that from?
Well, it's a great title, but it doesn't work for most people outside of Ireland. So in Ireland, if you get a new lawnmower, somebody says to you, how's your new lawnmower? You say, we don't know ourselves since we got the new lawnmower. It's just fantastic. You know?
Right, is that transformational? Is it the lawnmower has changed everything?
And so I did want that sort of slightly comic feel to it of, Ireland has become a marvel to itself. And also the literal meaning of, we still don't know who we are, it sets up this theme, as you mentioned, which really is the capacity of the society to know things and not know them. I mean, I always felt, people might remember Donald Rumsfeld going on about the known knowns and the unknown knowns, when they were talking about invading Iraq. And I said he forgot the Irish one, which was the unknown known, the thing we know and don't know at the same time. And of course, all societies have these capacities, to look away.
In fact, every single one of them does, I think, don't they?
Yeah.
Yes.
But I do think it's a particular strength and weakness of Irishness. It's a culture which was formed around the ways in which it organized knowledge and separated, to the point almost of kind of cognitive dissonance, of having one part of the collective consciousness which is actually very well aware of what's going on and another one which just completely ignores it and pretends it's not happening.
Your book is very clever in the way you set out to open a window on small episodes in your own life as someone born in Ireland in 58 and how that might reflect on a much larger change that was going on in society. In your book, you have this lovely sentence you write, "For all my life, until about 1980, I had been told to think of myself as the end of something and the beginning of something else." What is that end and what is that beginning?
So, as you said, I was born in 1958 and apart altogether from my own birth, it was quite a momentous year in Ireland because it was the year, happens to coincide with the year of really the beginning of this profound revolution, social, cultural revolution. It's really the low point of independent Ireland. Ireland, at that stage, it still wasn't much more than 35 years old as a state, and it was getting close to being a failed state. So you think about all the blood and all the passion that had gone into, the creation of an independent Ireland.
The massive sacrifice.
A massive sacrifice of, generations. And yet by 1958, the terrible thing that was happening was most young people were getting the hell out of the place. And they were going to the old colonial oppressor, right? They were going across the sea to work in England.
Very often in England, Irish people with an Irish accent would be treated as a dumb paddy and be treated with contempt.
Yeah.
How bad do things have to be in Ireland to make people think that they can still nonetheless have a better life in England?
Exactly, and it was humiliating. There was an element of national humiliation involved in this, And really the question was it worth it? Was it worth all the anguish to set up our own state if our young people are just voting with their feet and saying, actually, you know what, however difficult it is to be an Irish person in England, it's a much better life. And it was a better life because of free education, capacity to go to college, Remember, in Ireland at the time I was born, you did not have free second-level education.
Oh, really? You paid to go to high school?
You had to pay to go to high school. They were all owned, dominated by the Catholic Church, and they were all fee-paying. You had a very sclerotic, self-satisfied, post-revolutionary elite. The Prime Minister was the guy who was the last surviving commandant from the 1916 rising in Dublin against the British. He's still there.
This is Eamon de Valera.
Eamon de Valera is still there. But you did have a young civil servant. So a very, very talented guy. And he was just so talented, he'd kind of risen to the top. But he was still in his late 30s. A guy called T.K. Whittaker. He was the Secretary of the Department of Finance. So he was the most senior civil servant. And he just said, this can't go on. There's got to be nobody left. This really isn't working. And he published a document saying, basically, if we don't really change radically, then the thing isn't viable anymore.
Well, Ireland might just peter out.
Yeah. That it's just becoming demographically unsustainable.
And was there signs of it petering out? Were there like sort of ghost towns, ghost villages? And
one of the images that's still kind of haunting, because you'll still come across them if you're, walking in a remote area in Ireland. Certainly 20, 30 years ago, you would have seen this quite a lot, where you'd pass an old cottage and you'd look in the window and you'd see the teapot and the plates still on the table, just abandoned.
Like the Marie Celeste, was it?
Completely.
Like people had just walked out.
They just had enough and gone. And the young people, maybe, I don't know what happened, the mother died or something, the old mother, and the young people just said, we're leaving now, And so, yes, absolutely, it was very tangible, and it was demographic. So, I mean, a simple way to think of it is, this is Europe in the 1950s, repopulating after the disasters of the Second World War. Everywhere the population is growing. There were 2 countries in Europe that lost population in that decade. One was East Germany, for fairly obvious reasons, before they built a wall. And the other was Ireland, and they couldn't build a wall. I mean, they would have built a wall, by the way, if they could, but they couldn't keep the people in. So the demoralizing effect of that was so strong that actually there was an audience for what this civil servant was saying. And he published a document with the most boring title he could possibly think of, and the most boring look. It was called The Grey Book, colloquially, because it was a grey cover, and the title was Economic Development. And it just sounded like, this is really unthreatening, whatever. But what he was saying was, in order to develop the economy, we've got to bring in foreign capital. And this may seem very obvious now, it's everybody wants to bring in foreign investment. But of course, this whole place had been built on an ideal of self-sufficiency.
Ourselves alone,
Sinn Féin, and protectionism was pretty standard sort of economic policy in the 1920s when the Irish state was founded. The problem was protectionism only really works if you've got a growing market. A domestic market is you can build up and you can serve your own market. But if your market's literally leaving on the long walk, if they're going to America and Britain, protectionism just can't work. So what was happening was it was just kind of dwindling and dwindling. And it was an agricultural economy. I quote in the book, and I think people find it hard to believe, but it gives you a little glimpse of how primitive the economy was, which is, I found a table which had the top 5 Irish exports and the top 5 Irish imports. This is from the mid-1950s. And the top 5 exports, I noticed, had racehorses, and the top 5 imports had racehorses. I said, this didn't make any sense. I mean, why were we importing and exporting racehorses? The economy was so small that racehorses going to races in England were counted as exports, and coming back, they were counted as imports. And in both cases, they were among the top 5. So, it's hard to get your head around just how closed and dwindling this economy was. And young people were really very bitter because they were just sick of it, And so I'm a kid in the 1960s, and what we were being told was, you won't have to emigrate. This was so important psychologically.
You won't have to emigrate.
You won't have to emigrate.
And why not?
No, because, I mean, if you look, I suppose in broad terms, Irish labour was going to foreign capital. We were going to America and Australia and Britain. And now that foreign capital was going to come to where the labour was, which meant you could stay there. And this was remarkably successful.
So this was a radical economic proposition, but dressed up in very anodyne, sort of bland economist speak.
Yeah, in 1958, that year, one of my favourite novels was published, which was The Leopard by Giuseppe de Lampedusa, the great Italian novel, and it has the great line in it where it's set during the Risorgimento and all the kind of revolution in Italy, and the young guy is going off to join the revolutionaries, and his uncle, who's the aristocrat, is shocked, and he says, why are you doing this? This is terrible. And the young guy says, what you don't understand is that in order for things to stay the same, things must change. And this was the paradox of the whole Irish project, right? You have to remember, this was a conservative top-down revolution, which was that in order to keep Catholic nationalist Ireland, keep it the way we want it to be, we have to radically change everything. And it's a sort of fascinating experiment in a way in, can you do that? Is it possible, in fact, to unleash these forces of economic change and still have, in many ways, the same kind of conservative religious culture that you started out with? And they nearly pulled it off. It was a very close-run thing right up until the end of the 20th century, because Ireland still was a very conservative Catholic culture. And you could sort of feel they got pretty close to managing this almost impossible thing, where you go from being an agricultural society to being industrial and post-industrial indeed. Education becomes available to people. When I was born, Ireland was the least educated country in Europe. And now it's the most educated country in Europe. I mean, so you change everything. But could you then retain this...
The soul
as they would have seen
Ireland,
it.
as they would have seen it back then. You said you grew up in a working class part of Dublin. Your dad was a bus conductor.
Yeah.
And your mum was she a cleaner?
She was an office cleaner.
An office cleaner. That's right. Yeah. I think we'd say now that as a couple they were aspirational. When they moved into the housing projects, how did that change their lives compared to their grandparents, for example?
When I eventually got to university, my middle class friends were horrified. I remember somebody drove me home one time, and I could just see her looking around at the house and say, they're all the same. I mean, you just never seen anything like this. It was just a kind of common.
How could they not be aware of these housing estates? Could you easily avoid them then?
You could completely. So they were geographically, on the outskirts of the city.
Oh, to not contaminate it.
And so precisely. Right. And they, in a way, they actually made they made the old city look more respectable, because actually old Dublin was full of very poor people. It was notoriously had lots of slums and everything else. So it was a kind of slum clearance where they moved people like my parents. They would both have grown up in the inner city. I mean, right in James Joyce's Dublin, if you think about it that way, and they were moved out to this place. They were happy with it, because I mean they had running water, clean water, indoor toilets, So I remember visiting my mother's family in rural Ireland, not too far from Dublin. I mean, about 30, 40 miles, outside. But I remember as a child, I was only 2 or 3, but I remember thinking of carrying the water in buckets. And it came back to me, that memory, funny enough, years and years later. I was in Kenya and watching women, having to do this thing of hauling water. But, in the 1960s, the Irish girls, young girls who were talking about getting married, they had this sardonic phrase, the church's thing was you promise to love, honour and obey. And in Ireland, in rural Ireland, girls still had love, honour and carry water. That if you would end up your life, because you had kids, you having to go a mile or 2 miles to the pump and carry the water.
So that was in the wedding vow: love, honour, and carry.
No, it wasn't formally, but it was a saying. It was the saying that, but it was a kind of common saying among
Yes, now
girls,
I think that's come into the language. Oh, I won't carry water for that person. I won't, or I forced to carry water.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
That's the origin.
I think it's the origin of it. But so it was very poor, very underdeveloped, and so actually. We felt, so we were looked down on as kind of, working class wild kids out there in these housing estates. But actually we thought of ourselves as being really quite upper class, because we had an indoor toilet, we had running water. I mean, they were tiny, and of course they were crazy because they were for Catholic families. Contraception was banned, you have to remember. So it's hard now to remember just how much Catholic teaching was enforced as law.
There's a moment you wrote about, around about the same time your parents got married. There was a headline that blared in the newspaper, front page headline in the Irish Times. The headline blared, "Slight increase in marriage rates." This was a front page headline.
Slight increase.
Planes crashed into the Twin Towers. Slight increase in marriage rate. There was the demographic disaster of mass emigration. Yeah. What was going on here with this concern with the marriage rate?
So it is one of the great ironies, right? So you have this sort of super Catholic country, and Catholicism is obsessed with the family and, big families and all that sort of stuff, and marriage. And in fact, Ireland had the lowest recorded marriage rate in the developed world in the 1950s.
Why?
Because young people were leaving, of course, in such numbers, but also because they were too successful at scaring people off sex. The obsessional Puritanism was such that actually,
So courting was very difficult.
Courting was quite difficult, particularly in rural Ireland where everybody was watching you. I think one of the reasons young people got out as well was just this stultifying sense that you were being watched all the time. And when I say scared, I mean scared. And people might have heard of these things, but particularly for young, because it's always women, of course, who have to pay the price. Men don't. But for young women, there were institutions called Magdalen laundries, which we're still dealing with now, this legacy, Quite literally, if you were a young girl, you could be more or less kidnapped. If you were judged to be in moral danger or posing moral danger to others, you could be kidnapped, taken into one of these institutions, incarcerated there, made to do slave labor. These were laundries. They were commercial laundries run by nuns. And so these young girls, young women, very often, sometimes they were there for a few years. In some cases, they never got out.
What behaviour would constitute becoming an immoral woman? Would it be becoming pregnant or not even that?
Not even that. So it could mean becoming pregnant. It could just mean being very poor, from a family where your parents couldn't afford to take care of you. But of course, also it meant that girls who were being abused themselves. I mean, this is the grotesque nature of it, that actually if you were being abused and you maybe complained about it, you were obviously causing trouble. It was your fault. So, when I say people were scared, I mean, they were really scared. And this is this great tragedy of Irish Catholicism, that Irish people were genuinely very devoted to the church and to their religion, and it was a huge part of Irish identity for obvious historical reasons, a form of resistance, really. Britishness and Protestantism went together, and so the insistence that you must be Protestant. One of the great exceptions in Europe to this idea that, whatever the ruler says you are, you must be, was Ireland, where the majority of the population, in spite of actually really kind of terrible penalties that they suffered for remaining Catholic, did so. It was a really very profound expression of their identity.
So Catholicism is very bound up in nationalism.
Identity. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Catholicism actually stated explicitly in the Constitution of Ireland that it was the established religion of Ireland or something like that?
Yeah, so it didn't quite go to say established religion. The church did want that, but De Valera, whom we mentioned, kind of slightly pulled back to say, hold on a minute. But there was the state recognising the special position of the Catholic Church in the Constitution.
The special position.
Special position. But more importantly, actually, this was practical. So it was the church was allowed to control the entire education system, most of the healthcare system, and every single law that had to do with reproduction or women's rights or sexuality simply reflected Catholic teaching. So you couldn't buy condoms, for example, banned, or any other form of so-called artificial contraception was the phrase used. But divorce was banned in the Constitution. So it wasn't just that you couldn't get a divorce. There was a constitutional prohibition on the dissolution of marriage.
And if you wanted to end your marriage, was there any way to end an unhappy marriage?
Go to England.
Go to England.
Yeah. And of course, often what happened was that a man in an unhappy marriage would go off to England and leave the
Just
wife.
abandon the family.
Leave the wife. So the church is a huge institution in the society from the 5th century onwards. And the state arrives in 1922, So it could dictate. But also because it was this fusion of national identity and religious identity, it screws up both of them, actually. It screws up your nationality because it makes it sectarian, but it also screws up your spiritual and religious life because it makes it political. It just becomes another form of power. And that's the story, how this kind of form of power worked, and then also why it disappears so radically and so dramatically in recent years.
One of the major figures in Ireland while you were growing up was the Archbishop of Dublin, McQuaid. Archbishop McQuaid, the most powerful figure in the church in Ireland at the time. You write that he kept a telescope and a magnifying glass in his office. Why did he keep a telescope and a magnifying glass in his palace?
Well, the belief was that his telescope was trained on, there was a little island. He was on the coast, he had his own place on the coast, and he had a kind of tower, and he would look out on this island where courting couples used to go.
Presumably shout at them from the tower.
Yeah.
Bit more distance between you two.
It was kind of like psychology. He was watching everything.
Right.
But we definitely know, and this is provable because it's in the archives, right, which is the magnifying glass was for examining ads for women's underwear in the newspapers. Because
Really?
There's a letter, I swear to God, there's a letter in the archives where he wrote to the editor of the Irish Press, which is one of the main papers, saying, I have examined this ad for women's underwear and if you look at it under a magnifying glass, you can see the mons veneris.
The pubic mound of the woman under the underwear.
Yeah, right. And this must stop, basically. And, but of course it would have been stopped. So this is the whole thing. I mean, that this guy's power was such. Right. So the weekend I was born in Dublin was the Dublin Theatre Festival. Famous theatre city, like one of the great kind of theatre capitals of the world for a long time. Theatre Festival was a huge kind of showcase. The Dublin Theatre Festival was cancelled on the week that I was born, the weekend I was born, because the Archbishop McQuaid had indicated his displeasure at the fact that there were works by James Joyce and Sean O'Casey and Samuel Beckett going to be in the Theatre Festival. Particularly Joyce. I think he was particularly annoyed about Joyce. There was an adaptation of a little bit of Joyce's Ulysses. And he didn't make a speech. He didn't give a sermon. He didn't do anything in public at all. He just indicated the fact that he was very unhappy about this. And they just cancelled the festival. The equivalent of ABC, the state radio station, they had a requests program. There used to be all radio stations, and somebody asked for the Cole Porter song, "Always True to You, Darling, in My Fashion," and they played it. And the Archbishop was on the phone, saying, "True to you in my fashion." What is that? This is really outrageous. And ever afterwards, when they were asked to play that song, they played the instrumental version. I mean, it's
so he was like the unblinking eye of Sauron, was he? In his
completely,
tower? Right.
Watching everything. He had networks of spies everywhere, in the parishes. He knew everything that was going on. So I served mass for this guy. This was our parish priest in this housing estate died, and he'd been a friend of the Archbishop. So the Archbishop decided he would come to serve the solemn requiem Latin mass. The candles, the black vestments. It was a real show. But I'm walking up the road towards the church early in the morning to get ready for serving the mass, and there's this huge limousine. You've never seen anything like it, and it's parked outside the parish priest's house. And I'm walking up towards it, but I can't quite figure out what's going on. There's a man in a uniform kneeling on the footpath, and he's in a kind of grey uniform. And as I get closer, I see these two little feet sticking out the side of the limo. And I realize it's the chauffeur is polishing the Archbishop's shoes with the Archbishop in them. He has his feet sticking out the side of his car, and his chauffeur is kneeling on the footpath, just polishing up his shoes. And even as a little kid, even as a 7-year-old, I thought, I don't think that's what Jesus meant by, religion. This just doesn't seem right. But yet he was this very charismatic. He was a little man, but he had beautiful eyes, and I think he was very interested in young boys, because afterwards we did the mass, and it was really fantastic. And then he came back, and he was talking to us, and you kissed his ring and all this, but he was very engaged, and I just felt so in love with him, in a way, because it was like this was the power, it really was like a royal visit. And only subsequently did I realize that in the weeks before that, so in our parish was this big children's hospital, and he had appointed the chaplain to the children's hospital. And the chaplain children's hospital had been taking photographs of naked children, sent them off to London to be developed. The shop or whatever were developing them saw these, were very alarmed, got in touch with Scotland Yard, the police in London, sent the photographs to them. What did Scotland Yard immediately get on to the Commissioner of the Police in Dublin? What did he do? He went to Archbishop McQuaid directly. And McQuaid said, he's just curious. He's curious about, he's a bit naive. He doesn't know about this stuff. He's just, I'm going to get a good Catholic doctor to talk to him. So at the same time as you've got this kind of royal figure almost coming to your place, what we didn't know was that he was leaving this paedophile in the children's hospital next door, and then when that guy left, he appointed another paedophile, and so, this was so open.
Yeah, this must have been seen.
Yeah.
And it must have been
So
understood,
everybody,
though?
yeah. So this
known and not known.
This is the known and not known. This is one big part of it, is that everybody could see this and know it. These are intimate places. Everybody knows what's going on. But nobody could articulate it.
Because if you did, you might pick apart the whole thread of modern Ireland.
Exactly. And your own faith as well. Remember, people genuinely believed. But also, say I went to my parents and I said, something happened. And what were they going to do? They go to the police go to the Archbishop. It was just a closed system. And this is very, very toxic. It sort of teaches people to compartmentalize, to not see what you're seeing.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app. Or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
There's a wonderful phrase you use in your book called the Connie Dodger. Tell me what the Connie Dodger refers to, please.
It's one of my favourite things. If you don't believe that change is possible, you don't really confront it, right? For all the reasons we've been talking about. But you sort of get around it. People learn how to have these moments of defiance. And so, yeah, my two favourite examples are the Connie Dodger and the cycle regulator. So the Connie Dodger was... So in traditional Catholicism, the season of Lent was a season of prayer and fasting, and you were not supposed to eat more than one meal a day. But you were allowed to collations, they were called. It's a word I've never heard since, actually. And a collation was like a biscuit, a little thing, maybe a cup of tea and a biscuit. And in Cork, the second city of the Republic, there was a particularly conservative bishop. He was the kind of equivalent of John Charles McQuaid in Cork, and he was called Cornelius Lucy. He was known as Connie. But there was a woman baker in Cork who produced biscuits that were enormous, like huge disc-size biscuits, which were called Connie Dodgers, because you were, strictly speaking, you were only having a biscuit, but it was like a week's food. And the other one just briefly mentioned was the cycle regulator, right? So, as I said, contraception was banned, but as the place modernizes, right? So, as people like me start going to secondary school, for example, high school, you need teachers. You need female teachers to teach the girls. If they're all going to have a baby every year,
teachers.
The Catholic system is going to fall apart.
Right.
Similar to Catholic hospitals. If all the nurses are having babies, as they're supposed to be if they're married, the whole system will fall apart. So, of course, they all have to be using contraceptives. So how do you do this, right? So international gynecological studies started to note in the 1970s there's something really weird about Irish women. The level of menstrual problems in Ireland, right, is off the charts. Nobody's ever come across anything like this ever.
Right, there's just like this freakish outlying example of women with chaotic menstrual cycles.
These wild Irish women can't even control their own cycles.
Control their menstrual cycles.
And of course what was going on was that sympathetic doctors discovered was that you could prescribe the pill as a cycle regulator.
Right, to stabilise
your menstrual cycle.
Right.
But you couldn't prescribe it as a contraceptive. But again, this is just the way the society worked. There was ways around.
We are laughing about this, and it is very funny. And the phrase Connie Dodger is hilarious. But it does bespeak a terrible cynicism, and which in itself is quite corrosive, really, isn't it?
It's
morally.
deeply corrosive. No, you're absolutely right, because it's all about not confronting your own reality.
Yeah.
And in particular, shame. So it is funny, but it also means that, as a woman, you can't even talk about your own life. This really hit me personally because, I was always a bit of a kind of outlier, freakish, atheist journalist, whatever. But my wife was teaching in a Catholic school run by nuns. And so we decided to get married in 1983. And we both agreed that we weren't going to get married in the church. So we were going to get married in the registry office. I think there were 200 people were married in the registry office that year in Ireland, the kind of civil ceremony. But because we weren't getting married in the church, we had to advertise in the newspaper our intention to get married. And we thought, oh God, if the nuns see this, she'll be fired. She'll lose her job. Oh. Because, of course, she would not be married in the eyes of the church if we were married in a civil ceremony. And if we had children, those children would be illegitimate children in the eyes of the church. So we ourselves found another brilliantly hypocritical way of doing this, right?
How?
So the secret was that one of the great sources of Irish hypocrisy is the Irish language. We're all supposed to speak Irish and love the Irish language, and it's our, and of course we don't. But it meant that in law you could put any declaration or anything in Irish. So we put in De Valera's family newspaper, we put an advertisement in Irish. Fintan O'Toole, August, Clarny Connell, a bag poster, whatever, in the Irish language. And we sort of bet that nobody would read it. And they didn't. But it's sort of funny and it's kind of comic. And it's one of the reasons why the Irish comic tradition is so strong. But it is also humiliating. It's just also sort of, why can't I say?
I mentioned in my introduction this idea, which I got from your book. I didn't realise it, that there was this self-conscious project in Ireland to make it a moral beacon to the world. Was this something understood by you and most people in Ireland at the time?
Yeah. I mean, of course, Richard, it was compensation, right? It's compensation for being rubbish, like for having a bad economy, for being poor, for the pain of mass emigration. What you do psychologically, I think, as a society is you turn that around and you say you make a virtue of your miserable necessities, right?
But so we're poor, and that's the price we pay for our spiritual beauty.
We're poor, which means exactly that we're not interested in material goods. Were we ever interested in material goods? Of course we were.
We've got a new lawnmower, we don't know ourselves.
Exactly. So we reject materialist values. Emigration, well, it's not really a tragedy because we're spreading the faith around the world. We're bringing it to Australia. We've given you lovely things. And so absolutely when I was a kid, I mean, this stuff was everywhere. And it was tied in with our sort of exceptionalism. Somehow there was a virtue also in this suffering. It made us, the Catholic phrase about mourning and weeping in this valley of tears, that was really, and of course we'd all get our reward in heaven.
What is America to a young kid growing up in Ireland in the post-war years like yourself?
So we're obsessed with not being British and therefore have no problem at all being American.
So that's an acceptable way of being modern?
It's the acceptable way of being modern.
Right.
We'd no TV, by the way, until 1963, so we finally get TV. And
didn't Albania get TV before
Albania
Ireland?
got TV before Ireland did, yeah. But like the first thing I saw on TV, I remember like the excitement of it, turning it on, black and white TV, and there was like a traditional Irish storyteller telling old stories.
Sitting in a chair in a cottage.
Yeah, in a cottage,
like,
telling
really?
old stories. Yeah. Subsequently, kind of came to really admire this guy. He was a brilliant storyteller. But they didn't have enough money to really program their TV station. And the obvious thing to do was to get programs from the BBC, which was the best broadcaster in the world. But no, they weren't going to show British programs because that would take away the whole point. But American programs, they just bought massive job lots. So our heads as kids were just kind of completely filled with American Westerns. And that was a lot more exciting than the little elf fella telling stories. And a key moment was John F. Kennedy coming in 1963. And so we've got all these old guys. We still have De Valera, we've all that stuff. And there really is a sense of stultification, and most people are fed up with it. I remember as a kid, like even though I was only 5, but it was such a stark image of this decrepit old man meeting this, JFK is like glamour, Hollywood, sex. We wouldn't have thought of that, but of course we didn't know about his proclivities at the time. We thought he was a good Catholic boy.
But he was sexy, though.
He was sexy. Yeah, he certainly was sexy. He was young. The rhetoric, the glow of him was just incredible, But he was also an Irish Catholic, So it somehow seemed to reconcile this whole history of emigration. The pain of emigration was kind of worth it because we'd produced the American president, And
was Ireland sort of waiting for a pat on the back for that, do you think?
Oh, completely. I mean, I don't know if you do it in Australia, but one of the things we always did, you see, again, a compensation thing was kind of claim everybody,
In Australia, it was like when the Beatles arrived, they got off the plane, they went into the terminal, and a reporter said, "What do you think of Australia?"
Yeah.
That was the the national anxiety here.
What we do was genealogy. We'd find out,
Right.
my father was obsessed with boxing. He was a boxer when he was a kid. And he just loved heavyweight boxing. 1972, he's on his bus. They're going up the hills really early morning outside Dublin. And he looks out and he sees men running. I mean, this was like nobody ran, and they were wearing white tracksuits and they were black and they were beautiful and they were running up the mountain. And at the head of them, he realizes Muhammad Ali,
Muhammad Ali was in Dublin,
It was
jogging next to your dad's bus?
Yeah.
Wow.
And my dad, they stopped the bus. He said, rings up, stop the bus. And he runs out and he says, do you want a lift? And Ali gets on the bus. Can you imagine the sleepy passengers, and this man. And it was like,
good God.
And I remember my dad coming home and he was just glowing, I mean, he used the word that was almost disturbing. He said he was so beautiful. A man like talking about another beautiful man. But when Ali, they did his genealogy and they said, no, you're really an O'Grady from County Clare. You're one of the O'Gradys.
How did he feel about that?
Well, he was furious. I mean, because he had changed his name, for God's sake, to try to get away from the whole history of slavery and the idea that his ancestors might have been raped by, white slave owners and all, And so he was kind of furious. And it was starting to get kind of quite tetchy. Eventually, he did a kind of rant about saying, no, it's nothing to do with me. And then he brilliantly defused the whole thing. He said, but you never know. There was a lot of sneaking around in them days. And he knew, he had sensed that. Just mention the possibility of sex. And that ended it. It was over.
Running out of the studio.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. The most, I think, perhaps one of the darkest things, well, maybe the darkest thing in your book is the story of the so-called industrial schools in Ireland. You say that the kids of your era, you and others, were aware of these things called industrial schools. What were these schools?
So these were really horrific institutions. They were common enough institutions in the British world, I suppose, in the 19th century, where they were supposed to be kind of reformatories. And they were run by religious orders, particularly by the Christian Brothers. So kids were incarcerated in these places, maybe for like very petty crime. A friend of mine was sent off for stealing a bike, And he was a good kid. He was a nice kid, But more often, they'd done nothing at all. I mean, it's just that their parents couldn't cope. Maybe the dad was an alcoholic or something, or maybe a father died and the
10
mother
kids in
was
the
left with
family.
10 kids, or whatever, And so the kids were sent off to these institutions.
And would they just be like plucked away or something?
Plucked away.
And you didn't never see them again?
It could be years, and of course they were open season on these kids, for every kind of physical and sexual abuse.
These sound like gulags for children.
They were gulags, they were, and I've used those terms in Ireland. Did we have prison camps for children? Yes, we did, but people still don't like you to say these things, but that's what they were.
And here we go to knowing and not knowing again. Was it known and not known what was going on in these places? I mean, you said you had a dread of these places.
Yeah.
So there must have been knowledge of what
Exactly.
was going on. There was abuse and violence and slavery and the like.
And it must have gone back a long way because talking to my father, late in his life, his father died and his mother remarried. And she remarried an absolute thug. I mean, he was an awful person, violent, drunk. And I remember saying, so why did she marry him? And he said she married him because after my father's father died, they were going to put him and his siblings in an industrial school. And the only way to keep the kids out of the industrial school, she had to marry somebody. And the only guy she could get to marry her, she was a widow with 5 kids, was
Fintan.
this horrible guy.
So much of Irish history talks very heavily about a kind of a martyrdom, doesn't it?
It does,
There's all this martyrdom going on that no one's talking about.
Exactly. And, I never knew, I knew my granny, and she always struck me as being a bit sort of overly religious and stuff like that, and I never really sympathized with her, and it was only then I realized, oh my God, but the sacrifice this woman made, heroic sacrifice she made. But exactly as you say, Richard, not talked about, but known. I don't remember not knowing 2 words. One was Letterfrack and the other was Dangan, and these are place names. Why would I know those names? They were the worst industrial schools. And I do not remember a time when I did not know those words and what they meant, which was the horrible places you would be sent if you weren't good.
Now, in 1983, a referendum was put to the people of Ireland to put a constitutional ban on abortion because it was held that a child has a soul from the moment of conception. Yeah. So this is all done in the name of protecting the unborn child. But this is going on at the same time,
You know,
under the aegis of the same church.
the same institutions, you know, and the stuff that we've been discovering recently, you know, these are still very live stories in Ireland, by the way, Richard, you know, so not because it takes a generation really for people to face them, but I mean, they're digging up the bodies of children from another set of institutions we call mother and baby homes, which is where girls who were pregnant were sent away secretly, have their babies, the nuns would take care of them, and then they had to sign the babies away. They were often sold. They were sold to Americans. You make a large donation to the convent and they give you a baby, basically. But the state is just currently commissioning a forensic digging up of the corpses of babies from just one of these homes. And they know from the records that there's over 800 kids buried in what was essentially a kind of sewage system.
Why is there such a high infant mortality in these mother and baby?
Because they were terribly abysmally run. So what would happen, you know, and again, you've got to try and have some sympathy for, say, the young nuns who were sent to run these things with no knowledge of sexuality or anything going on. They just didn't know what they were doing. Gastroenteritis, for example, would break out. I mean, simple diseases, and, you know, dozens of kids would be killed.
So much change, real change came in Ireland from the booming economy. From this document you talked about, T.K. Whitaker wrote, which opened the Irish economy, brought down protectionist barriers. I remember once, just taking a side trip here, I took a trip to Europe and I stopped over in Dubai during Ramadan. And Dubai has been transformed in, 4 decades or something, from a fishing village to a city with the biggest skyscraper in the world and gleaming shopping centres and the like. Rapid, spectacular change and growth. And they were so careful to observe every last bit of Ramadan. It was really quite interesting to watch. It seemed like as the more spectacular or the more disruptive the economic change, it seemed more important to people. It seems, and this is generally true for people, to hang on to the old ways. You know, are we still good people? Are we? What are the lessons of our grandparents tell us about what we should do and how we should act morally? Ireland, you say, was trying to do this too, trying to modernise economically, but still hold to the old dream of being the moral beacon to the world. Yeah, it couldn't do it in the end, though.
No, but it's a great point you make, you know, because it's often people don't understand. I think there's a sort of easy one-to-one relationship between social change and cultural change.
No, they work against each other, I think, a lot of the time.
Often, exactly. Yeah. There's you want to hold on more. And that definitely happens in Ireland. So we had a big reaction in Ireland in the 80s, you know, with the abortion referendum. I mean, there was a referendum to try to legalise divorce in 1986, and it was defeated by 2-1. 2-1.
What kind of vote did the referendum?
It was
on
also
abortion?
2-1.
2-1.
So you basically had a 2/3 society with the 1/3. 1/3 was kind of liberalising, modernising, and the other 2/3 was saying no, it's gone far enough. It's not going to go any further. And so you had all those tensions, and by the end of the 20th century, right up until maybe 1999. Well, there were key moments. 1902, there was a key moment when one of the most popular bishops, Catholic bishops, Eamon Casey, turned out to have a child in America and a former lover, and that was really shocking. And in fact, if the church had just said, look, this is what happened, and if he'd come out and he said, look, I'm really sorry this all happened, but at least I was kind of trying to protect the child, and people would have actually been fine with it because the church still had such authority. What they did was they secreted him away in the middle of the night, you know.
Literally in the middle of the night?
Yes, yeah. And they sent him off to Ecuador, you know. And then they started saying, yeah, but we should understand, you know, that we're all human. And I think that was the point at which a lot of Catholics said, well, did you never understand that about us? Like, you know, does that not go two ways? So it was beginning really in the 90s. But the thing that broke it was the child abuse scandals. I mean, you mentioned the industrial schools, and a very good friend of mine, who was a magnificent journalist, she made a series of 4 TV films in 1999 called States of Fear, which were about the industrial school system. And they're extraordinary documents because they just let people speak, you know. And she made these very, very careful programs. The church really tried to go after her, and they really would have destroyed her if they could, but they were so well made that they couldn't. And that shocked the nation, and it sort of forced the government very quickly issued a big public apology, and a whole process of investigation started. And that was, I remember watching my mother, for example, who was, you know, very, very devout, very genuine, went to Mass every day. And she continued going to Mass every day, and she stopped listening to a word the church had to say to her, you know. And I remember saying to her, Mum, you've become a Protestant. I said, no, I haven't. I said, well, that's Protestantism, where you continue your own relationship with God, but you don't listen to the intermediaries, But that was happening. And it just got worse and worse. And they lied about it. They dodged it and they denied it. And now, I suppose about 25% of people go to Mass, and it was unthinkable. I mean, it really was unthinkable. I mean, this was an extraordinarily powerful institution.
Recently, I was having dinner and talking with a man from Ireland who migrated to Australia, and he was telling me that today, the average citizen in Ireland, per capita head, I don't know if this is true or not, Fintan, per capita head, the average Irish citizen has a higher income than someone in Britain.
Yeah.
I wonder what that means. Immigration has stopped.
Yeah.
People now move to Ireland. It's becoming a multicultural society.
Yeah.
The population's increasing. It's prosperous. It's part of the EU. It's pretty united. The whole issue with the North we haven't even talked about, but that's a whole other thing, I think. But it can look at Britain at the moment, which seems to be struggling terribly. The union's under strain. It's left the EU. It's been sort of in an ongoing recession since 2010, pretty much.
Yeah.
I wonder how Ireland now looks to Britain, whereas in the past it might have looked with resentment and animosity. How do Irish people tend to look at Britain now?
To be quite frank, there's an element of Schadenfreude, plus an element of sympathy. I mean, we're still very close to them, and we do feel their pain, but it is an incredible turnaround, right? So for 800 years, Britain was the dominant power, and Ireland has to sort of deal with that. But the Brexit negotiations with the European Union were extraordinary. And this is what freaked the British out, right? Because the Irish border became a big issue, which we won't really go into all the details of that, but it became a huge issue in the whole negotiation. And the Brits always thought they could just get the Irish in a room and bully them, and they'd get their way. And of course, they didn't realize, Ireland was part of a 28-member bloc.
That all swung in behind Ireland.
All swung in behind Ireland. I mean, it really did, really did. The solidarity for Ireland from France and Germany, Italy, and Poland and all the rest of it. And it really struck, I woke up one day and realized, geez, this is the first time in 1,000 years that Ireland has been stronger than Britain.
Britain's become a rule taker rather than a rule maker.
And we were on the strong side of the table, and we got our way in relation to this. And Ireland got what it wanted. But also, as you say, just at simple level, I saw the Financial Times had done some analysis recently, which said that the poorest people in Ireland are 60% better off than the poorest people in Britain now. You don't have the levels of destitution in Ireland that you now see in large parts of England, And I think Ireland is seeing itself more and more and more as a European country, I mean, now I think, last time I looked, about 14% of our trade is with Britain,
14%?
14,
would have been like 50% about 20 years ago or something, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So this process of, multinational investment, it's not uncomplicated or unqualified, but it has been transformative in terms of our relationship with the world and our sense of ourselves.
You're obviously very pleased about the change in Ireland. It's become a modern secular nation. It's become much richer. It's not a failing enterprise anymore. But has something been lost in the waving goodbye to the old moral beacon to the world prototype of what Ireland was supposed to become?
It's a great question, because, there are losses. I mean, for all the toxicity of this sort of double-mindedness, double-mindedness is also very creative, It's maybe one of the reasons why Ireland has this kind of outsized effect in terms of theatre and literature and storytelling of different kinds, and I'm not myself religious, but I do miss ritual, communal meaning, the ways in which we come together. I do think there's a vacuum in finding a sort of level of human solidarity, how we tell stories to each other. And in societies with a certain kind of intimacy is double-edged, right? So on the one side, it's surveillance, it's everybody knowing your business, it's the oppression. But if it switches, it's a sort of lovely thing, which is actually, I care about you, I sort of know who you are, and so I wouldn't be pessimistic about the fact that we might not just in Ireland. I think this is true of, we're all struggling towards this, which is what kind of collective language of belonging do we have? I don't think we can just ditch things like spirituality or nationality. I hate xenophobic nationalism, but it doesn't mean that there's not something really valuable in our sense of national identity. You know, I mean, I'm passionately Irish. I love being Irish. You know, it's completely irrational. There's no reason I should be proud of it. You know, particularly given all the stuff we've been talking about.
It's the intimacy with it, though, isn't it?
The intimacy. Oh, absolutely. It's my DNA. It's who I am. It's, you know, and I don't think there's ever anything wrong with that. You know, I think as human beings we need to have somewhere where we feel the ground under our feet. And Ireland, I think, is fortunate to still have some ground under its feet, even though it's undergone this process of very, very radical change. I'm 65 now, you know, and I feel I've lived through a period when politics, you know, for all its awfulness, you know, and failures, has transformed my life, the lives of people around me, for the better. You know?
The sausage factory made an edible sausage at last.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it is nourishing, you know.
Oh, Fintan O'Toole, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. I've so enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much.
Likewise, Richard. Really lovely talking to you.
Fintan O'Toole's book is called We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Ireland. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.